We've all been told that compound exercises are king. Since I got into bodybuilding at 15, 16 years old, I was hearing that. But, I was experimenting with compound exercises and isolation exercises, and it got me to thinking. When there's three muscles involved, like in a squat, for example, the quadriceps, the glutes, the lower back, the erector spinae, the question everyone should be asking is, are each of these muscles doing the best they can do, getting the most they can get, as compared to how they would be participating in an isolation exercise? They can't possibly be benefiting by the other one working simultaneously, right? They're doing their job, and that's all they know about. So the question is, how do we evaluate that? Well, you evaluate that using physics, you evaluate that using neurology, and using anatomical directions of motion. So the squat is a complicated thing to explain in short, but let me just say that the lower leg is the operating lever of the quadricep, and because of its barely 30-degree angle, it only gives the quadricep about 30% of the load that you're using on your back. And so since you can sense that you can use more weight, you put more weight on your spine, further compress your spine to compensate for the fact that you're using an inefficient lower leg lever instead of fixing that lower leg lever angle. Okay, so there's a thing there. When you're doing a compound movement and you're, let's say, hitting the glutes, hip extension, and quads, knee extension, each of those two muscle functions would benefit more by a different direction of resistance. But because it's one exercise, you have one direction of resistance, and so they both get compromised. If you change the angle of the lower leg, you diminish the glutes. If you change the angle for the glutes, you diminish the quadricep, right? So right away, we're talking about the amount of weight that you can lift is more because of these diminished loads on each participating muscle. So you think that you can load these muscles more because you're using more weight, when in fact, it's because of these diminished lever angles that you are forced to use more weight in order to compensate for these physics shortcomings. In other words, people think that if they do a sissy squat or something else that forces them to use a lighter weight, they assume the muscle is loaded less, when in fact, it's loaded with a bigger percentage of the weight you're using. And that's what we should be focusing on, is the amount of load a muscle gets, not on the amount of weight you're actually lifting. And then there's a couple of neurological things too. There's a thing called reciprocal innervation, which basically tells an opposing muscle to shut off. If you're doing curls, the tricep is shutting off. When you're doing squats, the glutes are firing and loaded. The hip flexors are disconnected by the central nervous system. One of those hip flexors is part of your quadricep, the rectus femoris. So here you are trying to build your quadriceps without knowing that 20%, 25% of your quadricep has been deactivated because you're trying to do two things at one time. So the last point on this is that people lean forward when they do a squat. They pretty much have to keep their balance. If you look at someone from the side and you realize that their torso is leaning farther forward than their lower leg is, and their torso is longer than their lower leg is, that means the magnification that their lower back is getting is significantly more than the load their quadricep is getting. So for all of these reasons, the idea that you're gonna favor a squat because it's a compound movement, not realizing there's neurological issues, there are physics issues, and then there's these, weaker links that are being compromised. In other words, that you could be injuring your spine. It is just foolish. You're better off looking at each individual joint function and muscle function and maximizing those if your objective is to have a totally strong body and a totally developed body.